There we go. So tonight, like I said, we're going to talk about pasture, predators, and parasites, the three Ps. And we're going to start with a little bit of grazing information, and we're going to finish up with parasite information. And some of this is a talk I put together with Tatiana. You'll see it mentioning goats quite frequently, and I know some of you also have some goats at home. So I'll try to say sheep, but it might say goats. Let me find my little arrow keys down here. There we go. So let's talk about grazing styles. We talk about browsers and grazers. So sheep like to graze, but they do browse. And goats would rather browse, but they do graze. So browsing, we mentioned this last time, but browsing is eating like leaves and buds and like grazing off the bushes and trees. And the llama likes this too. And so all of my farm is grazed up to a certain level, as high as goats can reach standing on their back legs or standing on each other's backs for that matter. So browsing is eating the brush. Sheep will tend to more graze on the ground, but they'll do a pretty good job defoliating bushes, especially in the spring when the leaves are young. So sheep are, I say they're picky eaters, but they're selective. They know what they want. If you've ever opened up a new paddock and let the sheep in, they go along sort of sweeping their head from side to side with their nose in the grass, grabbing at the things they really like. And sometimes it's the clover, sometimes it's certain kinds of grass. They all have their own favorites. I'm always like, don't keep stepping on it, just stop and eat. But that's what they do. They kind of go through and pick out the stuff they like. They generally like a pasture that's not taller than they are or hitting them in the eyeballs. They like relatively short feed, not like a golf course, but a little shorter, and we'll talk about why that is in a little while. And they will graze as high as they can reach. And they like to be able to see around them and to see each other, which is one of the reasons they don't like real tall grass, because they are a prey animal. And so it's always a good idea to have one eye looking out for predators. And of course, their biggest defense is grouping together. So they like to know where each other are as well. So lions and tigers and bears, oh my, they do need predator protection. And there's all kinds of predators out there. There's coyotes, there's wolves, there's cougars or mountain lions. Foxes, I've never had a lot of problem with foxes, but they could take a newborn. There's bobcats. Around here we have exceptionally large bobcats. Everybody thinks they're lynxes, but they're just giant bobcats. Eagles, now that there's more bald eagles in the United States or in the Northeast, they've become somewhat of a predator problem. Bears, neighbors' dogs, wild pigs, dingoes. I think they only have dingoes in Australia, but even crows. So there's some things you can do about that. You need good fencing, and you can use guardian animals. So let's talk about those things. This is what I got up to one morning. Actually, the picture of the coyote is from somebody's trail cam, but I walked down the back of my pasture, and a ewe had lambed out there later in the evening, and apparently didn't come up to the barn. And this is what I found. It was not a great way to start the day. And I knew she had a nice set of twins, and I just figured they were gone, but they were actually hiding under a log that was right next to that, and somehow managed to avoid getting eaten. So I had to raise them, but this is what happened to the ewe. So we try to make sure everybody's up by the barn before bedtime. This is before I had any guard animals, by the way. So there are lots of good fencing options. But think about this. This is often a misconception. Do most animals go under or over the fence? A lot of people think they go over the fence, but most of them go under, especially coyotes and dogs and that sort of thing. Excuse me. There's high tensile fencing. And I'm going to show you some pictures of these in a minute. High tensile is smooth wire. Usually there's 5 or 6 wires, even 7 sometimes. It actually has springs in it. You have to have very good corners because it's tightened. That's why it's high tensile. It's usually electrified, which means you need to mow or weed whack or do something to get rid of the green stuff growing on the fence. It is pretty easy to maintain compared to other fences to fix or maintain once you get it up and you got those good corners going. So that's one common possibility that's used for sheep and goats. Page wire is also common. Page wire or woven wire or barnyard fence, that's the kind with the squares. The problem is it often curls up on the bottom, or if you're going over any kind of a gap, there's in the ground, there's a hole there. So you might need to put a barbed wire along the ground, or be sure you really fill in the bottom so it doesn't have any gaps. And some people put a hot wire on top or just along on the inside to keep their animals from climbing on it. Now, stock panels, you may have heard of hog panels or cattle panels or combo panels. They look sort of like page wire, but they're solid. They aren't woven. It's welded together. So you wouldn't want to put your whole pasture fenced in with stock panels, but it makes a great thing to use around your barnyard, for example, or somewhere where you can't get good electricity to. And it does take a lot of posts because you have to have a post every 8 feet or so. But it'll last a long time. It's very sturdy. You can weed whack up against it, and because it's solid, it doesn't curl at the bottom, so you can put it down on the ground or dig it in a little bit. So we use the stock panels around the barnyard at the extension farm, and we call it the penitentiary. So it's someplace we can put the animals where they're safe and where they can't get out even though the power's out or somebody drove through the fence, which happens at the extension farm, which I'll show you why in a minute. There's also lots of good temporary fencing, and it has lots of advantages because you can move it where you need it. You can make your paddock bigger or smaller, or you might have a high tensile perimeter fence like I have at home, and then you divide it with electronetting. Or some people use 3 strands of poly wire on reels that are like all attached to a stake so you can string it along. I do have a little thing on using temporary fence, a little talk. I can't remember if it's in our course or not. I can put it in if it's not. I like electronetting, and I'll have some pictures of what those things are in just a minute. At the extension farm, we have no permanent fences except for the barnyard, and we use electronet everywhere. And it has to be hot or it doesn't work. How about decorative fencing? A lot of people like to use like split rail or post and planks across the front of their farm. Just make sure you have some real fencing behind it because that's definitely not going to keep out predators. So this is obviously early spring, end of winter, and it's hard to see the wires. Those are battens, those posts that are sticking up. And let's see, here you can see it better. There's the 5 wires. 3 are spaced out at the top, and then 2 are close together on the bottom. That's for predators and lambs. And that post that doesn't have insulators, those are creosote-soaked posts. This is the New Zealand style fence. There's other ways to do this, which I'll show you in a minute. This is high tensile page wire, so it's stretched. It doesn't have springs, but it's pulled tight. And this is quite tall because when I put this in, I had a lot of goats, and they could jump over everything. They did go out over the fence. Here they are, the little buggers. You see how she's standing on the fence, the one on the left, pulling it down. Goats can be really hard on the fence. And luckily, none of these have horns, so they don't put their head through and get caught. So here's a picture that actually has, excuse me, 3 kinds of fencing. The closest fence you see is the page wire, and we have that along the top of our sheep pasture, because we also have a whole lot of little kids that come and tour the farm, and they don't know anything about electric fence, and when they put their hands on there and then their mouth on it, they get a pretty big jolt from the electric fence. So we have page wire across the top. Over along the road are metal posts with 5 insulators, and we have single strand smooth wire through each of those, set up sort of like the high tensile was, with wide spacing at the top and narrow at the bottom. And the reason we have those is our farm is on a really dangerous curve, and people like to drive through the fence, especially on like Christmas Eve and 4th of July, or when you're giving a really important meeting in the classroom. So by having a few metal posts, we can replace a metal post easily and quickly, throw the insulators on it, and hook the fence back up, or splice it together, whatever we have to do. And now you see the dividers are white electronetting, they're not that easy to see either. The fencing comes with the posts right in it, and you sort of pick it up one post at a time, and then you roll up you don't roll it up from one end to the other. You gather all the posts, tie them together, then you roll up the folds of fencing. It's a little hard to describe. But we move that all over the farm. Here's the metal posts with the insulators on, looking the other direction. Okay, this is page wire. It's not put up very well. Matter of fact, I think it's upside down.
Let's see, I'm gonna.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, we had a question here about training stock to electricity, and I wasn't sure if you covered that a bit later or if we should talk about it here.
We should probably talk about it here. I've never had to do specific training except with heifers, like in a barnyard, but I try to make sure my fences are always hot. So.
Right. Well, and if you have mature animals and the young stock learn from the mature animals, that helps. The one thing there was a couple things shared there. It is important to make sure that the first time you turn animals into electric, that they can't get through it. So if they run through it the first time, that's a challenge. And also if they're heavy fleeced, so they really had to hit it with their face.
They're pretty insulated.
If there's a lot of wool on them, they'll be insulated.
Yeah, I did lose a wet lamb. I had electronet too close to where the ewes were lambing, and it just wandered in there in the dark and hit the electric fence, and I got it out. Yeah, that was bad. But I only had that happen once in all the years of lambing.
So one way that you can train them, if you have stock that have never been introduced to it, is if you put the wire in a building where they're inside, so if they touch it, they're not going to go through the wall. They're going to go backwards. May or may not be necessary, but if you buy stock, that's a good question to ask. Are they used to it? Have they been introduced to netting? So I too also lost a young ram lamb who got stuck in netting while I was on vacation.
It always happens while you're on vacation.
Was devastated that it happened, but those things do happen. So I think that probably addressed the questions there. And then there was a question about your field fence being upside down, and it has to do with the distance. So you see the top, those they're only probably 4 inches apart, and then as you get lower, they're 6 inches. Generally, your field fence, the bottom is where you put the tighter ones.
Right.
So that would be why that's upside down. So
I think that the times we were training heifers, we actually used our barnyard, which does not have an electric fence, but put electric fence around the inside of it. So when they went around touching, looking around and they touched it, they ran, but there was no place to go except back into the barnyard.
Right. So you want to have something secure. So it can be really good panels. It could be those hog panels with, the offset of the lighter stuff, something so that when they hit it, they don't go through it.
Run forwards. Yeah.
Yeah. You want them to stay in. All right. Thank you. I think we got up on those questions.
I put this in because I wanted to show how insecure this page wire is. It wasn't put up very well, I must admit. And they can push out underneath the bottom. They stick their heads right underneath the bottom and eat the grass, as you can see, quite a ways back from the fence. And sometimes they're stuck over there when you come in the morning. And we have taken this down and sort of changed it around a little bit. It was put up a long time ago by a bunch of students, which was really nice of them, but they didn't really know what they were doing. But you can see you do want to have a fence. If you put it up, you want to have it tight so that it isn't, this isn't happening. So let's talk about predators. There's guardian animals, and that might be you with a gun. So it's not that easy to shoot coyotes because they're pretty smart and they don't really stand where you can see them very often. But even if you happen to see them running away, and you can even shoot at them, behind them, anything like that, if it's safe, will scare them and sort of give them the message that it's your flock and your land and they need to respect you. This is according to the fur bearing specialists at ESF in Syracuse, which is our environmental studies place. I don't shoot a gun, so that's not my method. I have llamas. I'm down to 1 llama, but I've had as many as 4 at a time. I'll show you a picture in just a minute. Llamas are pretty good, but I have lost sheep with llamas guarding. But I've also seen the llamas really go to work, excuse me, and notify the sheep and make them stay in the barnyard. And they're very tall and they're very alert, which is pretty neat to watch. They make this whinny like a horse, kind of to warn the animals. And there's guardian dogs, or we refer to them as the big white dogs. Most of them are white, and they're Anatolians, Pyrenees, Maremas, Mastiffs. Those would be the most common, probably Akbash. And most of them are big and white and hairy, and they're all pretty similar, other than they come from different areas. And they sometimes have a little different guarding style. Like I like Pyrenees, but I find they guard the pasture, whereas the Maremas tend to lay with the sheep and guard the sheep. Wherever the sheep go, the Maremas are with them, whereas the Pyrenees might be going along the fence line barking at the neighbors. So this is my experience, but I've used a lot of crosses as well. The whole managing of the dogs is another challenge and another thing to manage, and it's not cheap to feed them. So I'll show you some pictures of those in just a minute. I've lost the least number of sheep with dogs, however, and I usually run them as a pair so that they have another dog to play with rather than your sheep. I have had people that had good luck with donkeys. I had people that have had terrible luck with donkeys. And I had a friend that had a donkey and a dog. And the dog guarded at night, came in, the donkey went out during the day. And it was like they touched noses and talked about it before they switched off. And it was pretty amazing. Horses, a mare can do a pretty good job. Most mares hate dogs and will chase coyotes out of the pasture if they know they're there. They don't necessarily love the sheep either, but at least they don't usually hurt them. And we've had good luck with cows by grazing our sheep and cows together until fall, when we have our worst predator problems in October where I am. So you wouldn't really want to face down this bunch. Llamas can be surprisingly aggressive if they don't know you. They'll come up and put their head on your shoulder and, blow in your ear hard, scary. And I've also walked into the pasture and surprised them and had them run at me and charge me until they heard my voice and realized I was somebody friendly. I hear things about only using one llama at a time because otherwise they bond with each other and don't guard the sheep, but I did not find that to be true at all. This is actually the father, mother, daughter, and son family unit, and the father was the boss guard animal, but the most ferocious one was the tall youngest daughter in the middle there, the really dark brown one. So I one day was getting my kids ready for school, and I kept hearing the llama with this funny whinny, and he was standing right in the opening to the barnyard, and he would not let the sheep out, and the other 3 llamas were behind him like an infantry. And didn't see anything, got the kids on the bus, came back, looked out the back window, and he was still guarding and wouldn't let the sheep out. And there was a big coyote going down around the outside of my pasture fence. So somehow that llama knew that coyote was around, and he was not going to let those sheep go out there. And I was very impressed because most of the time it seems like they're just hanging out. And llamas are also interesting because the father llama spent a lot of time with the baby llamas, which you don't see that in livestock very often. He would keep track of them. I now have one llama, and the sheep definitely look to her for guidance. This is Bear. He's a Great Pyrenees. He's the old style Pyrenees with the big fuzzy coat. And he was a rescue dog, and it took me probably 18 months to get him to really know what his job was. But part of that was me learning about dogs as well. He has a harness on because we had a whole bunch of kindergartners coming to the farm that day, and they tend to run up to him and like hug him and squeeze him, and it's a little scary. So I like to keep him on a harness when we had little kid tours. Not that he wouldn't hurt the kids, but it was for his own protection. This is Wanda. She was a Spanish Mastiff cross. That's why she's brindle. She was a great dog. She would jump the fence and go out and hunt coyotes in their dens. And she was super friendly to people. She had a bad run-in with a porcupine, unfortunately, which ended up in her demise. That's Wanda and Bear guarding the sheep up on the hill. That is my automatic foot trimming system there, those rocks. The sheep slide down those rocks and trim their feet. It's a great thing. These are my dogs at home. I have 2 really large Great Pyrenees and 2 relatively smaller ones. The smaller ones are now maybe 12 and 13. They're really old. I have them out at the extension farm, and I have the 2 big dogs here at home. They both work in pairs. When I used to have 200 and some sheep, I had them guarding different groups of sheep. And that's my handling system in the background there, that chute you see. These dogs are so friendly and lovable to people, and they look really slow, but they can move really fast. They also like to sleep in the feeders. And I did want to warn you that they're not cheap. Even the rescue dogs cost $300 or $400. They do come spayed and neutered usually, and with all their shots. Puppies are in the similar range from $300 to $500. That's Peaches with her nose sticking through. They all like to do that for some reason on the hog panels. And the other one is Sebastian laying there with his ladies, keeping an eye on him. It is a pretty amazing thing to watch. When I go by my barn on my way to and from work, I see the sheep at the round bales and the dogs laying out there with them. Oh, and I had to put this in because it's so funny. This is Sebastian. You could do anything to Sebastian. He was one of those dogs you could pose. So my kids were having a lot of fun taking pictures of him. So we're going to talk about the big 3, fencing, predators, and parasites. We did talk about a lot of those, and parasites will be at the end. But what about water, minerals, shade, barn access, mud, and rotating pastures? Water. You do need water, but I will tell you that when the grass is really lush, they just don't drink much water. They seem to get, the grass is like 90% moisture, and they're eating a lot of it. So if they're actually nursing lambs or baby goats, they might be drinking a little more. But you also need to remember on pasture, a lot of time the water gets dirty with algae because it's in the sun. So be sure to make it something cleanable. Don't use such a big tank that you can't flip it over and swish it out with a brush. They will eat snow this time of year, quite a bit of it, especially right now when most of ours at least are not having lambs and or nursing lambs. And there's no big crust on the snow, so you'll see them outside sort of grabbing snow to drink, even though they've got a full water. And you can either run water line out to the pastures, like if you're going to close them out there, you can use a water wagon, which I have a picture of in a minute, or you can have them come back to the barn. In my case, they come back to the barn because I like to know where they are at night, and I have my minerals there and the water both. And they tend to come back and want to lay in the shade during the day as well. And you'll find out during parasites why that's not such a good thing. When I had 200 sheep, we closed them right out in the pasture, and they had to stay out there. We had a lot bigger paddocks as well. So minerals, you still need minerals in the summer. And you can either feed them out in the pasture in a mineral feeder. They make these mineral feeders that turn with the wind so they don't fill up with rain. And you don't want to put 50 pounds out there at once. You need to put out a little bit at a time, just enough for them to finish, because they do get spoiled in the rain and the humidity. Loose minerals, I'm not sure if I mentioned during the feeding talk last week that they don't really have a rough enough tongue to get the minerals off of a block. So you really should buy a loose mineral made for sheep for them, and they'll get a lot more of what they're supposed to get. Now remember, on pasture, a lot of times you're not feeding grain, so that might be their only source of salt and minerals. Now in terms of shade, technically it's not necessary. I mean, in studies they can show that they don't need shade, but if they can get shade, they will certainly use it. And the shade could be trees. I will tell you, if sheep lay under the trees long enough years in a row, it'll kill the tree because it compresses around the roots of the tree. Sometimes that's good where you're trying to clear land. Sometimes it's bad because you really wanted that tree for shade. Mine have killed off most of the trees in my pasture, but the great big trees with rocks around the bottom seem to be okay. But they'll use shade if they can get it, and they'll come in the barn or get in the shade to get away from the bugs. I live in an area where the bugs are really intense in the spring, like May, June, and then it's not so bad, but they'll just want to get away from like the biting black flies and that sort of thing. Barn access, technically it's not necessary unless your water and minerals are there. So you could close them out of the barn if that fits in your system and they don't need to be in there for anything. They will go in there if you, most likely will go in there if you let them to lay down. Here's some sheep out under, just must be early spring because there's just barely leaves on the trees, but they're laying under the trees anyways, in a little shade, feeling safe. So how about mud? Mud is not a good thing. I had to, excuse me, had to move some gates to a higher place. Like I put the gates where I thought was logical for using the gates, but it made more sense after realizing there was just going to be a mud bath going through the gate that I should move the gate up to the middle of my barnyard where the ground is higher and it's dry. Same thing with your waters. Sometimes it gets muddy around the waters. So you may need to make your waters so you can move them. You can run that black plastic water line a long ways out through your pasture to other, and make different spots to hook on a short hose so you can fill tanks out in the pasture if you need to, or just in some different places in your barnyard even. And what about wet areas? Now, where I live, everybody has wet areas in their pastures where it just doesn't drain very well. And the things that grow there, the sheep don't really like very well anyways. But the other thing that grows in those areas is snails, and they carry some of the parasites that are really bad for the sheep. They might not carry the actual parasite, but they might be something that the parasite passes through during its life cycle. So I always think of wet spots in the field, but there's also wet areas along hedgerows or under the edges of the woods. I once ran my electronet through that corner of the woods so the sheep could have shade, and I ended up making a lot of them sick because it was always wet. There's a lot of dew down in there, and they did get in where the snails were. And in the snail trails were the little things that had the liver flukes from the deer. And that made my sheep really sick. I lost 15 out of 90 ewes that fall, or that winter. It took a long time for the vets to figure out what was happening. And so anytime you can improve the drainage and keep them out of those wet areas, that would be ideal. This is one system. I used this when I had a lot of sheep. It has a big 600-gallon tank on top and a little hose that goes down to a small tank with a float, which you can't really see very well in this picture, I guess, but it's behind those sheep. Let me see if I can get my laser pointer. So the water comes out of the tank, goes down this hose, and there's a little tank here that's easy to dump, and it has a float on it. And then I have minerals in one of these pails, dog brushes in that pail, and dog food in the big can. And you can pull this around with a tractor. So when it would get empty, we'd take it out of the pasture, roll it up to the barn, fill it up, and bring it back. And we could pasture sort of on all sides of it. And then after we moved it, I would throw grass seed on that spot. So let's talk about rotational grazing. Rotational grazing is a style of grazing management where we're trying to keep the grass in a vegetative state all summer. It doesn't always work, but it's certainly better than just letting it all go to seed. So it sort of uses the same theory as mowing your lawn does. So you keep mowing your lawn at home to keep the grass short and keep it green and soft, like to walk on in your bare feet. If you don't mow your lawn, or the places that you miss get tall, it goes to seed. Those long stems where the seeds are tough and not very digestible. And for sheep, they tend to poke them in the eye and that sort of thing. So we're going to try to basically mow the pasture by rotating the sheep from one section to another. So if you divide your pasture up into smaller blocks, and we call those paddocks usually, and we move the sheep from one to the other over a series of days. And we'll talk about the cycle here in a minute. And we try to keep it in a vegetative state as much as possible. So this lets you get more out of your pasture, both more volume and especially better quality. And you can adjust your paddock size if you're using temporary fence, because at different times of the year, depending on the weather, it's going to grow back at different rates. And the other thing you have to remember is if you have 50 sheep and now you have 75 lambs out there, and those 75 lambs are growing over the summer and starting to eat quite a bit of pasture, so you might need a bigger paddock than you did before. So there's lots of ways to get around that you can do things like haying the paddocks that you aren't getting to in time, that are getting ahead of you, and you can go behind and clip if that helps make it. It mostly makes it look nicer, but also seems to help keep the weeds down. So it's a little tricky because you're managing your animals and you're managing your parasites or your pasture, and you're managing your predators or your dogs, and then you've also got to manage for parasites, and they don't always line up perfectly. So normally in a pasture rotation, if you were just going for the best quality forage, you could come back into your pasture between 21 and 30 days, and the grass would be grown back. I'm talking about the Northeast here, so you'll have to adjust for where you are. And you could start around the rotation again. But for the parasites, we only want them in the paddock 3 to 5 days. So you would need a relatively small paddock, and you need longer time between grazing to let the number of larvae on the field decrease naturally. So they really like it to be 60 days or more. I'm finding if I can get 35 to 40 days even, that's way better than going in at 25 days. And that's because we'll talk more about the parasites in a little while, but that's because of the parasites. So you have to think, if you had, you couldn't go back for 35 days and you could only be in for 3 to 5 days, you need like 8 or 9 paddocks just to make it around in the right amount of time. So you need a lot of dividing to do it correctly. I mean, when people say pasturing is easy, to really manage your pasture is actually a lot of work. So here's some pictures of the sheep out on pasture with the dogs. Got all 4 dogs here. And electro-netting. Then the big flat pasture makes it easy to put up electronet. It's really tough going through trees or brush with electronet, or cornfields double, I'll tell you from experience. And here's our wagon. I actually have 2 water tanks on there, so we don't have to bring it up as often. We actually had to fence a couple of these dogs out because they were loving the lambs so much that they were taking them from the mothers and mothering them, but then the sheep wouldn't always take them back. So they were in prison for a little while till they kind of got over that. This pasture is a little too tall. This looks like reed canary grass. It's a very wet area of the pasture, and when we had a lot of rain, which we did one of the summers we pastured there, I think I wore my rubber boots all summer, and it was actually like ankle deep water at the bottom of that grass, which isn't great for the sheep, and especially not good for, it is really good for growing snails, which means it's not so good for the sheep. And what we do is we drive the tractor down through and put the electronet up that way. And we did hay off the rest of the field so that we could take it off and let it grow back, because it got ahead of us, obviously. Now the sheep, if you look at it, it's reed canary grass, and it has a long stem with sort of leaves that go off, alternating up the stem. So it grows a little differently than other grass. And the sheep will go through and pick all those leaves off, and you can see that they were leaving a lot of stems here, and they actually did pretty well, but it's kind of hard to find your sheep when you're grazing them in this kind of pasture. Here's a little tool I thought I'd share with you. It's called Planimeter, and there's several different phone apps that use the same name, so I can't tell you which one this is exactly. But you can get on, you can put in your address, you can zero in on your farm, which that's part of my pasture there. And you can pin the corners of your paddocks or wherever you're going to put your fence, and it tells you the length of each side. And then it also tells you the area that's within that. So I find that really useful. My fence pieces are 164 feet long. So I can also pace off pretty well from putting up fence over the years. And I use that for planning. I like knowing how many acres are in there. It gives me an idea about how long it might last. And that's a very hard thing to predict, by the way. You need to really get some experience on looking at a pasture and figuring out how long it'll last or how many animals could graze in there. And if you have a new farm, it's going to take you a few years to really get a feel for it. We do have a rising plate meter, which is it has a round plate on the bottom and it has a handle that goes like a pogo stick up and down. So you can go through the field and you read the little dial and then you do 50 bounces with the rising plate meter. And then you read the number again, and then you have a formula, and it can help tell you how much dry matter is in the pasture. And it has to be sort of calibrated for the type of pasture you have. But I have used that to help people make up plans for their farms. And you'll see they'll graze in all kinds of places, and they're doing a little browsing here. And just you can see the effects of rotational grazing here. The sheep are covered with burdocks. I just noticed that. Darn. Have eaten in the pasture they're in. We just put up the new fence. You can see where we drove the tractor along and threw fence off and then put it up. And they're looking at that green grass, wondering why we're not letting them in there. But that'll be the next pasture. And then they won't be allowed back into this pasture they're coming out of, and that'll have a chance to grow back, and it'll pretty soon look like the one on the right again. That will probably go through 5 or 6 more pastures before they come back to this one. Here they are out in the new pasture. And what we did, we didn't move the water trailer. We actually just put the fence out around the water trailer so they could still get to it. Sometimes it's not that easy to move that thing.
Betsy, there's a question about how many days, weeks do they stay in each paddock in the rotation?
We try to only have them in 3 to 5 days, 7 maybe early in the season. So we have to adjust our paddock size to match up with that. And that's you can't really just talk to somebody on the phone or on the internet and say, make your paddock this big. You have to kind of see what's out there and
every season's different.
Yeah, and everybody's soils are different. My soil at home is sandy and dry, and last summer there was nothing to eat for a couple of weeks. And at Cooperative Extension, we have a little different soils, and it stayed green pretty much all summer. So it's just it's a very hard thing to predict. There are tools you can use. Would be a little extensive to go into in this lecture. But yeah, I only shooting for 3 to 5 days because of the parasites. Like I say, you could go up to 7 if it's cooler out, and we're going to talk about a little more about that when we get to the parasites.
Okay, there's just a follow-up question. How do you know when it's time to move them on to the next paddock?
Okay, so they go, you don't want them to eat it too short. Like, it shouldn't look like a golf course when you come out. But as you can see, where they came out here, it's all different heights. So it is a challenge because they'll say put them in at 8 inches and take them out at 4 inches. But you have to sort of take that with a grain of salt and average it out a little bit because you have tall stuff and short stuff and different species of weeds and grasses in there. So when the good eating is getting close to gone, you don't really want to, denude your pasture too much because it'll won't come back fast enough. So you want them to eat the best stuff and then move on. It's hard to give you a very specific rule.
Right. And from a plant growth perspective, the plant starts to regrow at about 4 days. So if you leave them in there, they're going to go back and eat that new tender stuff. So.
Right. And I put this picture in because it's ideal if you don't back graze. Like in this case, we opened up the top of the hill for them and they had to come back through the pasture they were coming out of. Just not good for parasite reasons, and also not good because, like you said, Lynn, in a few days that'll start to grow back and they'll start to graze back there. But we sort of had to do that in this situation just because of where it was.
There's plans and there's practical applications sometimes. So there was another, and
right.
We might get, it sounds like there's a lot of interest in grazing, so we maybe we'll have to do some follow-up. But roughly how many square feet of pasture are you allowing in the case for this group here that you're, although that paddock they're in now looks like it's a pretty big area.
Yeah, I mean, that was when we had 80 sheep and we sometimes had 10 cows and their calves out there. So we were putting up probably 16 or 17 electronet rolls that are 164 feet long each.
So some of it comes to management. How much do you want to spend? How much time do you want to spend moving animals, and the intensity of it? So
that's right. And some
there's a
people,
lot of
it's not worth
components.
it for the time, but it is if you're trying to raise like grass-fed lamb, for example. You need the really good quality. But it's time and it's physical effort as well.
Okay, I think we cut.
So I just put this in so you could see an example of a solar fencer. We do run some of our fences off the barn where we've got fencers mounted on the wall and plugged into a regular outlet. But I've never really liked solar fencers, but I've come to appreciate them as they've improved in their ability to do a good job. And so that's a solar fencer. We have a metal post that we pull or pound in depending on where we're putting it. And it has a couple of, let's see, maybe I should be pointing to this stuff. This is the fencer. It has a little on-off switch here and connectors here, one to the fence, this one connects to the ground rods. And I say we now have these great rods from Premier One Sheep Supply that have a T. So when you're pushing them in by hand and pulling them out, there's something to hang on to, which I really like. They happen to be right there in a spot where it's really hard to get them in the ground very far, but we usually try to put them in a little further than that. They're right along the edge of what used to be a road, so it's really hard to get anything in there, even with a hammer. And that's the electronet. And when you do your electronet, you attach the fencer to one end, and then you make sure it's not connected over here. And we sometimes run two fencers, and we just open the fence. We disconnect the fence on the far side so that each fencer is doing half of the fence, but they're not touching each other. You just unclip them here at the top. Make sure they're not touching anywhere going down here. Electric fence is a whole nother topic. And you see I have this side open. We must have been putting up a couple of paddocks here. The side's open for the tractor to come out. So this is a little blurry, but it's a pasture that needs clipping. You can see tall brown weeds here. This is my pasture. It's really hard to clip in here because there's big giant rocks sticking up. And it got ahead of me in there because there's things like thistles in there that they won't eat. And of course, in a pasture situation, the things they don't eat tend to go to seed and therefore spread very easily. And that's the other problem. If you eat your grass down too far, you're just exposing the soil to those weed seeds that are flying around. So ideally, this would have been clipped before it got to this stage. That was a tree that was in the pasture. I can't read this one because the thing is in the way here, but I think it talks about overseeding clovers. And you can do that into your grass pasture. We did that. This was sheep pasture, was mostly bluegrass, had a little clover, but it had been dug up and we planted various things in there for different experiments, and so it was kind of thin. So I took in the winter, for us, this works where you have different seasons. In March and April, we still have a lot of snow on the ground generally where I am, so I put on a cedar. It's like a backpack, only you wear it on the front, and it has a little crank like an organ grinder. And I actually put different clover seeds in there, some red, white, and pink mixed together. And I walked down through the fields and sort of scattered the seeds. And you can see the two dark green paths here where I walked that came in that summer. It was a good spring because it rained hard a couple of times after I put the seed on and kind of pounded it down so it had good soil contact. And it came up really nice. And then over here you can see the sheep all laying and eating in the part where the clover came up. And so that just improved the quality of the pasture by providing some legumes, which tend to grow when it's warmer out. And when the cool season grasses slow down. And I used 3 different kinds of clover because they're all a little different. The red is taller and the white tends to stand up good to grazing, and They have different qualities that sort of complement each other. So if you were doing a big field, you wouldn't want to do it with a front pack. You'd want to use a tractor with a spreader. So I wanted to mention grazing solar arrays. So there's getting to be more interest in solar arrays, and they're slowly moving into some of our farm fields, which is a whole nother topic about whether we should be using farm fields for putting solar arrays. But the nice thing is, even if it's not your land, but somebody's putting up a solar array, you could get paid to graze that. They need to keep the weeds and things off the solar panels, and they can't put goats in there because they actually climb on the solar panels. They can't put cows in there because they itch on the solar panels and knock them over. And so sheep are great. And we have a bunch of sample contracts at the American Solar Grazing Association, which you can see down at the bottom there. If you Google that, they have a whole nice web page, and they have sample contracts on there that you can use. So to do solar grazing, you need to have a way to move your sheep to the solar array and then maybe bring them home. So some people that do this, they lamb early in the year before there's grazing. They can then market or feed the lambs in the barn, or possibly at a different solar array, and then they can graze the ewes all summer and get paid like $250 an acre to graze your sheep. So some people are making more money grazing than they are on their lamb, which is kind of interesting. The idea is to get there before the company puts up the fence or the water or builds the thing, and get it written in so that they build you a fence that's predator proof. Make sure that you have enough access so you could drive a truck and trailer in there or get a tractor in there if you had to, and that there's a way to have water. And a lot of them, they will put a small well for you so you don't have to carry water to all your animals, or you can do the water wagon idea depending on how far you are from a source of water. Can you do rotational grazing inside the solar array? Well, it depends a little how big the solar array is. Some people are, the idea of rotating is going from one solar array to the other and moving the sheep from one to the other, or if it's a big array, you can actually divide it with electronet. You just have to be sure that the company that's doing and maintaining the solar array understands the electronet and how to turn it off, and especially how to turn it back on again. And that they also need to maybe fence off some of their, well, they have like little concrete pads with electrical stuff on them, and you don't really want the sheep all laying up on there and leaving manure up there. But most of them have been, it's cheaper for them to pay somebody to graze than it is to pay a company to mow it. So you may still have to go in there with a weed whacker and hit some of the tall weeds that the sheep miss, but boy, you can do a lot with it. And there's a big study going on at Cornell right now on how it affects pollinators and how the lamb growth is and all that sort of thing. So that'll be really interesting to see when we find out from that study. But it has a lot of potential for raising a lot of lamb in the Northeast.
And there is a link to the Solar Grazing Association in the
classroom
general forum.
Oh, good.
The favorite general sheep resources
Okay.
that was in the introductory section.
So let's talk about parasites. By the way, there is a whole small farms class on pasturing, pasture management, which if you're really interested in pasturing, to me that's the part of the fun of having sheep, is trying to control my pasture with grazing. I would highly recommend their online course for pasture management as well. I got partway through it and got too busy, but I'm going to try to go back and watch the rest of it. So parasites are a problem for sheep and also for goats if you have them. So you need to learn to manage your parasites like you're going to manage your forage and manage your animals and manage your marketing. Lots of managing going on. And you have to try to coordinate everything because they don't always all have the same needs. So one thing you could do is to take the integrated parasite management or FAMACHA class. If you see it offered in your area, you can take it in person, or on Wormex. And I think in a few slides, I actually have the address for that. It isn't actually at Wormex, it's at the University of Rhode Island, but you can get there from Wormex. which is a great website, by the way, to look up parasite stuff. And they can also, keep in mind, they can build some resistance as they age, and that you can select for genetic resistance to parasites. They haven't really figured out which gene it's on yet, but they do know that they have results from selecting for it. So along those lines, that means that the young are more susceptible, and the really old ones are really susceptible, mostly because their immune systems aren't as strong, and in the case of the young ones, they aren't as built up yet. So I have to keep an eye on them in August, because sometimes people forget that their yearlings are out there. And around here in August, about the middle of August, we start to have heavy dew on the grass again, and that moisture allows the parasites to sort of come back to life and make themselves available to the sheep to eat. And so sometimes towards the end of the summer and into August and September, we can have some challenges with parasites again that we sort of forgot about when it got hot in July. They do tend to build resistance as they age until they get really old, and that's a good thing. We're going to talk about why you don't want to kill all the parasites at once, because if you try to kill everything, then the only ones that survive are the resistant ones, the ones that are resistant to the dewormers. And so you need to leave some so the sheep can build up their resistance, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute. And there's a time when they're somewhat susceptible, like at lambing and kidding, or really any time that they're under a lot of stress. But there's something about the spring that causes them to be, it sort of turns on the sleeping parasites that are inside them. So you can select for genetic resistance. You learn to recognize those that, excuse me, that carry the resistance. And we're going to talk about selective deworming and how to find those. And you can use that tool to select ewe lambs or doelings to keep for your flock. And that way you can build a flock that's resistant. And you can also use breeds that tend to be resistant. And I don't know if it's really that the breeds are resistant or it's just the way they've been raised. Like hair sheep are known for being a little more resistant, but they also tend to be have been used in a grass feeding type system for a long time. So people probably naturally selected for worm resistance. But there are some breeds, and I'm drawing a blank at the moment. Hopefully I've got a slide on that a little further along. Again, take the IPM or the FAMACHA class. The online FAMACHA training at the University of Rhode Island is here at this website. URI stands for University of Rhode Island. Sheep and goat, FAMACHA. And that helps you learn to treat the ones that need it. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. And we're going to talk about which dewormers to use and how to do fecal egg counts. We're not going to cover the fecal egg counts today, but we will look at a little bit of the other stuff. This is normally an all-day class that I teach. So this is from Tatiana at Cornell. Know your weapons. So pasture management. We're going to do evasive grazing, and we're going to try to avoid the barnyard effect. We're going to talk about nutrition and the immune system, genetic selection, and then how to use dewormers correctly. There are good chemical dewormers. There is a lot of resistance to those dewormers, but if you use them correctly, they will have less resistance and they'll last longer. And then probably the most important thing is to only deworm the ones that need it. So how is the pasture management to reduce the barber pole worms? Barber poles are the worms, you might hear them called Homunculus contortus. Those are the worms that suck blood, and so they can make the animals anemic. And they are probably the one that causes animals to die. Whereas the other worms, the other stomach worms, will make them look unthrifty. Maybe they ruin their ability to absorb a lot of nutrients correctly. But the barber pole is the one that actually kills animals in our area. So we're going to talk mostly about the barber pole worm. We're going to try to use clean or safe pastures. That means we're going to talk about pasture height, how long to put them in there, and how much rest. Remember, I mentioned 3 to 5 day, up to 7 day time in a paddock with 60+ days of rest if possible. And it's easy to say, but not that easy to implement for the entire grazing cycle. the weather doesn't always cooperate and you don't always have the help to move the fence when you need it and that sort of thing. We can use multi-species grazing. Cattle and sheep are good together or one after the other because the sheep and the cows don't share parasites. Some people have horses in with their sheep or running after their sheep in the pasture. And it doesn't work with goats, right? Because goats and sheep and llamas too will share the same parasites. So if you're running sheep and goats together, it is multi-species grazing, but it's not the type that will help you with your parasite management. There are some forages you can use that help keep down the number of worms, or helps the animals fight them off, actually, I would say. And we'll show you a picture of those in a minute. And you're going to be especially careful of young weaned stock, or hardworking does and ewes who are lactating, and lowest priority for your dry animals, because usually once you've weaned the babies off, they're pretty tough to the parasites. So take a look at this. This is a little confusing, but the dotted line is the one you want to pay attention to. And on the bottom are days on the pasture, or days of growth on the pasture. And so the sheep were put in on day 0, and they started depositing larvae through their manure onto the pasture. And the number, I don't know the exact number, but it goes up pretty high. And it starts to decrease. So if you look at like 21 days, there's still a lot of infective larvae on the pasture. They're calling them L3 larvae, but they decrease after that. That's why they're encouraging people to not put sheep back on that pasture until day 60. And this 0 must be that when they took the sheep out of the pasture. So we don't want to put anything back in until like day 56. But I've found if I can make it to day 35 or 40, that even that's way better than hitting them back on the pasture in the 20s. So let's talk about evasive grazing. We've mentioned it a couple times, but we want to move the animals fast enough to prevent them from infecting themselves from their own feces deposited during that time on the paddock. So these sheep are pooping out manure that has eggs in it, and the eggs are hatching, and the larvae have to go through a couple of stages and shedding their skin and growing to be infective. And so they have a little while, but not a long time before that happens, and then you need to move them. So it takes 3 to 5 days to hatch at 75 to 80 degrees. So that's pretty warm. It takes a lot longer at 50 degrees. And a lot of times where I am, we're grazing in the 70s. So we have to have a short duration. So if you can do 3 to 5 days, we push it to 7 when it's cool in the early season. The days and the nights are longer, and we can keep them in the paddock that long. So we have to adjust the paddock to be the right size to work for that amount of time. So Tatiana's recommending that you play it safe with a 4-day to 7-day grazing duration. And you need to move them. If they run out of feed, you need to move them anyways. So she says less than 3 inches because most of the parasites are in the bottom 2 inches. And then you need to allow a long enough rest period that there's a substantial die-off of the larvae before the animals return to graze. And they recommend 60 to 105 days. We don't have that long of a grazing season here, so 105 days would be maybe never returning to the pasture paddock. So we've tried it a little shorter. We do get some that are 60 days between, but because we sometimes have to come sort of back and forth through the pastures, some of them are a little less. But ideally for the forage, it'd be quite a bit lower than that. But we got to really, the parasites can be a big problem, especially if it's a wet summer. So I have 35 plus there, if you can make it up to 35, 40 days. So much is going to be dependent on the weather where you are, because I know some of you are in a much drier climate than we are here. So the problem, which I just mentioned, is that the pasture rest periods to control barber pole worm need to be longer than the normal recommendations for either pasture health or nutritional value. So that's the way it is. So you need to clip or use other animals to eat the pasture in between. So what can you do? Are there safe pastures that the animals can be switched to as the grazing season progresses? So if you have goats, you can put them in a brushy pasture and they can do some browsing. One of the most practical ones is hayfield regrowth. So a lot of people take first cut and then could graze. We sometimes graze the hayfield first and then let it grow back and then cut it, and then can graze it again later. Or if you're grazing off your paddocks ahead of yourself, then ahead of your animals, I mean, then there you're going to take off the parasites that are there. Or you can use a hayfield that's never been pastured and go onto that and graze the second cut instead of making hay out of it, or even after the second cut. A lot of times in the fall, when really the parasites have built up on your regular pastures, you can then switch to the hayfield that's clean. You can use pastures that your cattle or horses have been grazing. That's what I was calling multi-species grazing. You can use crop residues. I've gone in and grazed after they combine corn. Some years there's a lot there, sometimes there's not much there, and it's really hard to put electronet through, but it is possible. You can plant some annual pastures where you're going to reseed your pasture, so you plow it up and you plant millet or something like that, and they graze it off and they don't go back in there. You then reseed your hayfield. And now a lot of the dairy farmers are using cover crops, and if you can work it out with them, you can actually graze some of their cover crops that they're putting on after they take the corn off, either late in the fall or early in the spring before they plow it under. So there's some options. I really think grazing your hayfield regrowth is probably the best one. So here's some more ideas. I'm not sure I agree with all of these. It says you can mow your pasture extremely short during the rest period, or maybe just clipping. So if you mow it really short and then you don't get rain for 2 weeks, you're not going to have any pasture there. So I would suggest maybe clipping off the tall stuff, but still leaving some pasture there. The idea of that is that it dries out and that kills off the larva. So if you have enough pasture that wouldn't matter. If it didn't come back right away, that would be okay. Grazing other species during the rest period, like we mentioned, cows or horses, probably most likely. Harvesting a hay crop or baleage before resuming grazing, all things we've mentioned. Some alternatives are growing forages or browse that'll have less parasite problems. 80% of the worms live in the first 2 inches of the vegetation, and grazing those high tannin forages may reduce the effects of parasitism. And we have a couple forages here. We have forage chicory, Cereus lespedeza, which is kind of a weed, but it does help if the animals will eat it. It will help them have less worms. And birdsfoot trefoil, and we actually did a birdsfoot trefoil study on our farm where we grew a field of birdsfoot trefoil, and it's not easy to grow a field of just birdsfoot trefoil. And then we weaned the lambs and put them onto the trefoil, and we put the other lambs onto a regular pasture. It was basically grass and clover, and we measured the worm loads. And the lambs that were on the birdsfoot did do a little better, but it is a lot of work to maintain that birdsfoot trefoil. It has to be a pretty hefty stand, 50% or more. We can't grow Cereus lespedeza, but you might be able to in a warmer climate. Up here, I think it'd be considered an invasive. We did get it to grow one summer, just a few spurting strands in one spot, but there are places you could grow that. Chicory doesn't have as strong a tannins, but they really like it. So if you're putting in a forage mix, you might consider some forage chicory, just in case it helps. Certainly wouldn't hurt anything. This is some birdsfoot trefoil. It's like kind of not viney exactly, but stringy, and it kind of lays down in a mat. They have to kind of pick it up, and it took them a while to learn to like it. And then once they figured it out, they really liked it. I want to mention the barnyard effect. A lot of us have a barnyard with a manure pile, and where the manure pile is, the rain's on there and it runs down through the grass, and the grass grows like crazy, and so they're always eating in the barnyard. But this can lead to a high concentration of parasites in the grazing material around the barn. And it does affect people's worm loads in their animals. And you can even have that happening in the pastures that are close up to the barn or aren't rotated. So how are you going to reduce the barnyard effect? And maybe you have to do a little of all of these or one or the other, but you can lay down gravel, concrete, or herbicides. In other words, make it so there's nothing to eat outside the barn. You can close off access to the barnyard and provide hay in the barn so that they're eating the hay instead of going out and doing moonlight grazing, where you don't want them to eat right around the manure pile. Or there's also, it isn't even so much the manure pile, but because they congregate there and they sleep there, there's just a lot of manure around the barn. Make the barnyard so small that there's no place to graze. Or you can close your animals out 24/7 out on the pasture if you've got good predator control. So rotational grazing in the spring does appear to reduce the barnyard effect, at least for a little while, and sort of delays the onset of summer parasite problems. So these are three I think they were goat herds actually. So the one with no rotation had a fecal egg count per gram average of 23,000, which is huge. And the two that were rotating were 3,500 and 2,200. And they started out rotating for the early part, but by July they were also high. So it doesn't necessarily help for the whole summer, but it does help you get off on the right foot. It's a lot easier to start at 3,500 than to start at 23,000. So there's also something we call the spring rise in the barber pole worm egg counts. So the barber pole worm overwinters as an L4, that's a larva, L stands for larva, sort of asleep inside the host. And something during kidding and lambing, we're not sure if it's the hormones or the light getting longer, daylight getting longer, something turns them on and they finish becoming adults and they mate and they start shedding eggs, so that now your animals are going to go out on the pasture shedding eggs. And then when the immune system is compromised by kidding and lambing or other stresses, this can cause them also to break out of dormancy. So all those things are usually happening about the same time. And that does happen with other roundworms or strongyle worms. And they may also overwinter outside if it doesn't get as cold as it does. Like here, I suspect they die in the winter. It's really cold. But if those of you that live in the southern parts of the country or in warm areas, you can have worms that stay on the pasture year round that live out there. So that's one good thing about our cold winters here. So they've also shown that a high level of nutrition will help stimulate the immune system and help keep the worms from having as big effects. So when the immune system is suppressed and it doesn't fight parasites, those arrested larvae acquired in the fall do mature all at the same time. And so that's also the reason that we sometimes deworm everything at kidding and lambing time. So about the only time you'd want to deworm everybody in your flock or herd. In terms of the nutrition, you can actually increase their protein consumption, and that will help reduce the flush of egg laying and parturition. So if I have them on say a 14% protein diet, to get 130%, I'm going to have to go pretty high, like almost 20%. Well, maybe 18, 19% protein diet to get them up to that level to help reduce the flush of egg laying. And I've tried that, but it's hard to say I'm actually reaching that with the method we're using. So I can't say that I've done a real study on that. I do try to feed the ewes really well just before lambing, or with enough protein. Let's put it that way. And I mentioned the deworming right at kidding and lambing. We really recommend that you don't deworm everybody. I did do it last year because they were pretty high and they were going to be on the concrete for a few days. Well, for a few weeks, actually, not out in the pasture after I dewormed them, so they wouldn't be dropping the resistant worms on the pasture, the eggs of the resistant worms. And so I did try that, and then I lucked out and we had a really dry summer and we never had a worm problem, but it could have the opposite effect if they went out and dropped those on the pasture and then we had a damp summer and would have a whole lot of resistant worms. I would say I was lucky. I took a gamble. Their minerals are really important for a good immune system, so make sure you have your loose minerals available. And any disease which depresses the immune system, like coccidiosis or Johne's, which we'll talk about next week, can cause increased worm problems. And older animals whose immune systems are down. So we can select sheep and goats for low fecal egg counts, and a lot of times we use the FAMACHA system, which we'll talk about in a minute. So in the old days, we're going to talk about selective deworming and why you selectively deworm the ones that need it. In the old days, well, I think I was alive during the olden days, they used to tell us to deworm everybody in your herd and do it at certain times of year, like June 1st, July 15th, and September 1st, and then once after it, we have a good frost. And use different dewormers during the year. And then after you deworm them, move them to a clean pasture. So that way they're only eating clean pasture. And you could always use a new drug if it wasn't working. But we made one bad assumption, and that was that the dewormer killed all the worms. And it doesn't do that. So we had to change our strategy. So we're going to be out with the old version. Now we want to keep some worms on the pasture that are not resistant to the dewormer. So we're going to call that refugia, and I'm going to explain that in a minute. So the proportion of the population that is not treated by dewormer treatment is in refuge from the dewormer. So we're not going to treat all the sheep, only the ones that really need it. Refugia includes the worms in untreated animals and the eggs and larvae on pasture before the treatment. And that provides a pool of genes sensitive to the dewormer. So that dilutes the genes resistant to the dewormer. So over on the left, you have all the worms that are out there, little graphics. There's so many are susceptible, and there's a few that are resistant. And then you treat them with the drug, and all that's left are the resistant ones. Right? So if you just have resistant worms out there and they're reproducing, then your dewormer is not going to work the next time. And so if you do this over and over again, then pretty soon none of your dewormers work. And that's what we're finding has been happening. I can tell you on my farm that ivermectin does very little. So we're going to try not to do drug treatments to everybody. So there are different dewormers out there, and you have some great charts in your resources that I would print off. If I were you, they'd tell the different dewormers, and they tell the dosage, and they tell the withdrawals. And the ones that are approved for sheep at the moment are albendazole or valbazen, ivermectin or Ivomec, moxidectin, which is cydectin, which is related to ivermectin. These are all drenches, and levamisole, which is called Prohibit, and that's a powder that you mix into a drench. And why do we want to use a drench? Because it's going to have a shorter withdrawal time, and it's going to put the chemicals right where we want it in the digestive tract. Now, in case you have goats, there aren't as many things approved for goats. There's valbazen, again, which is a drench, and fenbendazole or Safeguard, most people call it Safeguard, or Morantel or Rumetel, or you might hear it called Positive Pellet. And it's really confusing because they all have several names. But here's the most common sheep dewormers. You see ivermectin on the left, that's a drench. Prohibit, you mix up into a drench. I remember when ivermectin came out in the early 80s, it was like a miracle drug. And the problem is everybody used it so much that now there's a lot of resistant worms to ivermectin. Prohibit is less safe than ivermectin. Ivermectin and cydectin and valbazen have a very high LD50, like they aren't like poisons, whereas Prohibit is more like a poison that you give and you try to give just enough to kill the worms and not your animals. It isn't quite that bad, but you see the valbazen on the end and Safeguard, those are both white, what we call white drenches. They look like Elmer's glue, and they're kind of sticky, and they are white. You have to mix them, shake them up good. And The ivermectin and the cydectin are kind of like soapy water. And the prohibit looks like orange Gatorade, so you need to be careful what container you put it in when you mix it up, because it probably tastes pretty bad. At least the animals act like it tastes pretty bad, so I don't think anybody would drink very much of it, but do be careful because you do mix that up in your own container. So those are 3 different families of drenches. The cydectin and ivermectin are one, the prohibit comes from another, and the Valbazen and Safeguard, the white ones, are another family. And they're sitting on my goat box, by the way. That's the goat box for dehorning goats. So if you're going to use chemical dewormers, and we all need to use them at different times, you want to use them correctly. So you want to administer it with a drench gun, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute, orally, back behind the tongue so it goes into the rumen. And it's not like a taste test, right? You want to make sure you get the right amount in there, and you want it to go in the right place. And then remember, there's a withdrawal period if you are milking your animals or if you're sending lambs to slaughter. So dewormers should generally not be injected. Now, you'll hear people say they used injectable ivermectin or what do they call the other one? No, not dexamethasone. There's another one that people think they should inject, but you really shouldn't, because the withdrawal, you don't know what the withdrawal is. It's not labeled for that use, and it doesn't even always work like you think it will. So there are also some dewormers that are in pellet form or that you put in the water, and it's a little hard to get the right dose because you never really know how much they're eating. Unless if you're feeding goats on a milking stand, maybe you could get away with, putting it in their grain and having them eat the whole thing. I tried to do this with my llama. Of course, llamas want the grain all the time until I gave them the grain with the dewormer, and then they took like 3 bites and walked away. So, like if you were to spread dewormer and pellets out in a feed bunk and they were all eating, you would not know that they were getting the right dose, and that's really important. Now, if you have goats, you want to use 1.5 to 2 times the sheep or cattle dose per pound on some of the other dewormers. Goats have a faster rate of passage and larger livers. And this is something, porons. There are porons for cattle. We don't recommend that you use them on sheep and goats, especially on sheep because it's hard to get to their skin. And for goats, because it tends to hang around in their system longer, which makes more resistant worms. And that's what we're trying not to do. So here's a dosing syringe on the left and a backpack with a dosing gun that's on a hose. And you can calibrate that. You can turn this little yellow knob here, and this will go up and down and be calibrated to how many mLs you want. And that one's pretty accurate. This one also has markings on it that are hard to see here, but it's very hard to do a real accurate job with this one, especially if you only need a couple cc's. Just isn't that precise of an instrument. And I really like using the backpack if you have more than one animal. But you can do it. You notice they both have a long end here that you can put in the side of the mouth where the sheep have no teeth in the middle there, and you can go over the back of the tongue. And this one is nice because it's not terribly long. I bought a drench gun that must have been meant for cows. It had about an 8-inch long end on it, and first of all, you don't need it that long, and you may be hurting the sheep with that long of a crook on the end. And it's also really hard to get into their mouth because it's so long and you don't have much control. So there's a couple of ways to increase the effectiveness of a dewormer if it's not working. If you're having trouble, you might try, and this is not for animals that are really pregnant or have some other really high nutritional profile need at the time. You can hold them off of feed for 16 hours and deworm them, and then keep them off of feed 12 more hours. That's, like I say, you can't really do that with animals with a high requirement, but we've done things like put them in the barn in the late afternoon, held them till morning, dewormed them, and not let them out till the afternoon. So you can sort of modify the exact hours, but keep that same principle. Or you can just deworm them twice, 12 hours apart. maybe in the evening and then the next morning, or vice versa. And with the benzomadols are the white dewormers like valbazen and Safeguard. But the parasites are not equally distributed to all individuals, and this is an important concept. We think that all the sheep have parasites, but they really don't. The resistance of the animals to the parasites really differs. So 20 to 30% of the animals carry over 80% of the worms. And they're the ones that are shedding the eggs out on the pasture and contaminating the pasture. Those are the ones we want to deworm. So take a look at this graph. That's FEC, stands for fecal egg count on the left. And all those little pink bars are individual animals. So that's their fecal egg count, which is an indication of the number of worms, or sort of the best measurement we have. You can see it varies a lot from basically 0 up to over 16,000. So if you look at this, about 33% of these animals carry 80% of the eggs. So if we could just deworm those, that would really reduce the amount of eggs being shed on the pasture and still leave some resistant worms or non-resistant worms. So treating a third of the herd gives just as good control as treating the entire herd. The trick is figuring out who those are, right? So we got to have a way to figure out who we need to treat. And I'm going to skip this one for a minute. We're going to look at the 5-point check. These are the things you're going to look at. We're going to talk about FAMACHA in a minute. That's looking at the eye color, the color of the membranes around the eye, I should say. Bottle jaw, which is a symptom of a heavy worm infestation, and I got a picture of that. Body condition and or shiny hair coat. That's their general thriftiness. Whether they have diarrhea, and whether they're slow moving, like are they trailing along at the back of the pack, or slow to get up, or really look kind of depressed. So this is bottle jaw. This would be an indication that you really need to deworm these sheep quickly. When they have a heavy load of parasites, they actually sort of leak. This is indication of not enough protein, so it affects them, and they're low in protein, and because their blood is being sucked, and they get this fluid under the chin. Now, if you have lambs, you see at the bottom there's a lamb with a hard swelling, like right where the neck meets the jaw. And you might see this especially common in hair sheep, and you'll see it in boar goats sometimes also. And that is not bottle jaw. That's their thymus, which sometimes gets enlarged when their immune system is kicking in. But these are, if you look at the sheep up above, that's a soft, loose pouch full of fluid. Those animals should be treated right away. So let's talk about how we select. We do a 5-point check that we just showed you a picture of, and include FAMACHA, which we're going to look at in a second, in order to monitor for barber pole worm, as well as worms that cause things that are easy to observe, such as diarrhea and poor growth. So the barber pole worm, even though it's one of the worst ones and kills them, does not cause diarrhea. So you can have lots of worms happening at the same time, just to make this confusing. The FAMACHA system was developed in response to the development of severe dewormer resistance in South Africa. So this is a copyrighted system. It's a method of selective deworming that decreases the number of deworming treatments given in a flock, and therefore it significantly decreases the rate of parasite or of dewormer resistance. So this is what we call a FAMACHA card, and that's a little picture of a sheep's eye where you're pulling down on the lower eyelid and looking at the color where the blue arrow is pointing. So you can see that they're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the bottom, and 1 is dark red, and it gets lighter and lighter until you get to number 5, which is white. And if you have white ones, you need to treat them right away. They're really anemic. So this correlates with the anemia that these animals are experiencing. And as you notice, these two are, 1, I can't see where I'm pointing, can you? 1 and 2 are darker, and they have a check. You don't need to treat them, they're good. 3s, we're going to talk about whether to treat the 3s. 4s and 5s should definitely be treated. So you're gonna, I wear mine on a string around my neck so it hangs down right about by the sheep's head when I'm doing the FAMACHA check. So you should do it at least every 2 weeks during the grazing season, and it's only good for the barber pole worm. And it's you can't get a card without taking a certification course, so that's another good reason to take the class. Now, if you have 1,000 sheep, you're probably not going to FAMACHA check all of them every 2 weeks. It's just not practical, but you may gather them up and do spot checks through the flock to see if there's a problem going on. And you could miss some, but you might have an idea at least. It works great in smaller flocks where you can get a hold of your animals. So you're going to treat adults with a score of 4 and 5. Those are the lighter colored ones. And you might treat young animals that are at 3, 4, and 5. And you can see here it shows a little chart of how the numbers and the colors correlate with their packed cell volume, which is their red blood cells, and whether to treat them or not. The card on the right is their old style FAMACHA card. So you should treat sheep and goats in categories 4 or 5 with an effective dewormer. Yeah, that means you need to know which drugs are working on your farm, and sometimes that's hard to know. And one thing I've done is done a fecal egg count, treated the animals, do this with a couple, and then a week later, 7 to 10 days later, take another fecal sample and see if it worked. And I was lucky when I did when I dewormed all the sheep and goats last spring, when I was sort of taking a chance. I did do fecal sample before and after, and I really had almost no fecal eggs after I treated them. So I was lucky that my dewormer worked really well. And I was glad that I kept notes about which dewormer I used, because now I know that one works. If you're worried or if you have a question, you should go ahead and treat them. Lots of times I treat 3s, the middle one, if like it's a ewe nursing triplets or something like that, so she's stressed. You need to not just look at the FAMACHA, but to look at the 5-point check, your rotational grazing, and your treatments. Oh, we don't need to talk about this. This is complicated, but basically you need to keep an eye on them and check them every 2 weeks or so. And if you're finding a lot of them, you might want to check them more often. So if they're number 3s, if greater than 10% of the herd or flock is in categories 4 or 5, you probably want to treat the 3s too. Young animals, really old animals, stressed animals, animals that are working hard. If I've just weaned off all the lambs and the ewes are just going out onto relatively clean pasture, and I have a 3, I probably won't bother to treat her. But anything that's thin or working hard or really young and they're a 3, I would treat them. So I'm going to just go back to that other slide that's out of order here. There. Don't buy resistant worms. It's hard to know if you're buying resistant worms, isn't it, when you look at an animal? So all new additions should be quarantined and aggressively dewormed upon arrival. That means deworm them with all 3 dewormer classes. Don't mix them together in your syringe, but give them separately on the same day or close together at least. And then keep them in quarantine for 14 days and don't put their manure out on the pasture. You can perform a fecal egg count to be sure there's no more worm eggs being shed. And the kind of thing that gives our New York State veterinarians nightmares is people that bring in loads of goats from Texas or loads of sheep from the South where there's a lot of dewormer resistance, and you plop them onto the pastures in the Northeast, and we bring along all those resistant worms. So those of you that are in Texas and the Southeast, you probably already know about parasites and are careful, but you really can have a real challenge. I mean, there's one way to keep them off of parasites, and that's to not have them in the pasture and have them eating out of hay feeders. But most of us enjoy grazing and like to see our animals using the grass that's out there. So learning about parasites is a a major amount of information to learn, but it's certainly something to be aware of. I'm trying to give you a little introduction of the main topics, and then hopefully you'll be able to go back and take the whole course that's offered. You might try, those of you that aren't in New York State, you might check with your cooperative extension or take the one that's online, or at least read about it. So sheep and goats in the pasture make a great scene. They're good therapy. The grass is coming. Doesn't look like it out there right now, but it's coming. And so I thought I'd show you a couple of pasture pictures. These are lambs. These are my hair lambs on pasture. In the spring, I just love standing out there and watching them. One thing I like about the hair sheep is that they come in all colors, and it doesn't matter. Can be really nice working out in the pasture. I always just enjoy being out on my property and seeing the sunset and that sort of thing. And here, look, I ran out there, but I couldn't find the pot of gold. But it was kind of nice to see a rainbow coming down onto my pasture.
Great, Betsy. Well, we're a couple minutes over, but we had a couple questions here that
Sure.
I missed. Mr. First asked, how is biowormer and then a fungus-based preventative?
Oh, it's great if you can find it. It is expensive, and it needs to be fed a lot. Like there's one that you can put into the grain, and there's one that you top dress or you feed separately. And I looked into it. I couldn't find any place where I could actually get it yet in the U.S., but it has potential.
Premier One, does Premier One carry it now? I think
they might.
And I also missed, I think, Christopher had a question earlier. So 35 days and 5-day period, you need to divide your pastures into 7 at least. And I think, Christopher, that was back when Betsy was talking about balancing between rest for the forage, but also parasites.
Right.
But yeah, so if you could divide it up,
you really need like 8
way.
paddocks.
Yeah, just to spread it out just a little bit longer. And then, of course, you get the forage maybe is a little bit more mature than you want. So that might be where you could go in and clip pastures if you need to set them back if it's in the heavy growing season.
Well, and it's really a challenge. Like if you only have 5 sheep or 10 sheep, how do you make those little paddocks and move them that often? And so I'm sympathetic that it's not that easy to do. It's easy to talk about, but I have 4 or 5 paddocks, and then I divide those in half and go from there. And it doesn't always work out because the weather affects your pasture so much, but you do the best you can. Try to do a little of all the different things and make it work.
And in times where you have excess forage or, earlier in the growing season, you can actually, if you've got more space and more paddocks, you can do what's called flash grazing, where you leave them in a shorter time. They're going to go in and eat the cream of, the best stuff up the top, and we'll kind of set things back. But there's a lot of good resources on grazing, and certainly if there's questions or you're looking at trying to set up a grazing system, we can help you with that. And also in the worming section, there's a link to the information on the classes, the Flamantia classes that are on through WormX. So
it's really hard because I'm giving you little parts of a bunch of different things. So I apologize if it was confusing.
Tremendous amount of information in a short amount of time, but there's a lot of support materials and Teachable as well.
Also, I did want to mention, I just re-recorded this week my kidding and lambing talk. I haven't had a chance yet to get it and post it. Last year's is in there, or maybe even older than that, is in week 4, but I'm going to try to get the new version in there tomorrow or Monday. So don't watch the kidding and lambing video yet until I get the new one in there.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Again, if you have questions for us, feel free to contact us through email. As I shared in the webinar notice today, it's best if you email us directly. If you email through Teachable, it goes through the Small Farms Program, and there's no way we can change that. So that's why we give you our direct emails. But
And
Again,
if you think it's something other people would be interested in, write it in the forum, and
put it right in the forum. That's a good idea too.
Trying hard to keep up on that. It might take me a day or two if I'm busy, but I will try to get to that. Plus, you can learn a lot from each other. There's a lot of really interesting things in the forums this year. So thank you all for hanging in there for a long talk, and we'll see you next week.
Great. Thanks, Betsy. Have a good night, everyone.